Hey there, Craig Hewitt from Castos here. Excited to show you about how podcast distribution really works. I think there's a lot of kind of myths and misconceptions around this. And in just a couple of minutes, we're going to submit this podcast that we've created in the Castos dashboard to Spotify, Amazon Music, and Apple Podcasts, literally with just a few clicks of a button. Okay, let's dive in. Here in our Castos dashboard, we have our first podcast all set up, and it has an episode, right? I published one episode and said, hey, don't worry, this is just a test. Okay. So from here, let's go into the settings area of our podcast, and we'll go to the distribution tab. Here we see that the podcast is public as opposed to a private podcast, and it has an RSS feed, and that's right here. We can click this button here to copy the RSS feed. This is really the magic, the way the podcast is automatically distributed from the Castos platform every time you publish a new episode out to places like Spotify, Amazon Music, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and everywhere that your audience is already subscribed to the podcast. Now it's time to use that RSS feed to establish this connection. Just the one time we have to make this connection between the Castos platform and your podcast and everywhere that your audience wants to listen. And we'll do that in the Directories tab. Spotify makes it really easy. You click the settings button here and say, use the direct integration and take me there. This will open up a new tab in your Castos dashboard, and you just click the Submit to Spotify button and say, yes, submit through the integration. Get the green light, and your show is going to be live in Spotify within the next couple of hours. So we can go ahead and close this tab, this pop-up now, and then go, while we're in the integrations area, to Amazon Music. Amazon Music makes it almost as easy as Spotify. You have to click two buttons to get your podcast live here. They just want to know where your podcast is coming from. Since I'm in the United States, I'll scroll down here and say I'm in the United States and that I want to submit through the integration. Bam, Castos has now submitted your podcast successfully to Spotify and Amazon Music in literally 2 minutes. Next, we're going to close that out, and I have another tab open here for Apple Podcasts. So you see podcastconnect.apple.com up in my URL window up here. You can see I have a couple of podcasts down here, and these are all ours or my kind of personal podcasts. The thing you want to do here is add a new podcast. So click on the plus button and say you want to add a new show. And you have an RSS feed, right? Because we copied that from our Castos dashboard before. We're going to click Next, paste that RSS feed that we copied from our Castos dashboard previously, and click Next. We're going to grant access to every user that we have within our Apple Podcasts account, and we'll say Add. Here, Apple Podcasts is going to take a few minutes to digest the information from your RSS feed that you pasted in just a minute ago and show information like the cover image and the title of your podcast and you as the host, all the information that you entered in your Castos dashboard when you created that podcast. We're going to refresh this page here in just a minute, and it'll show all the information about your show, and you'll be able to set your podcast live. Here in the Apple Podcast dashboard, let's refresh the page and see information about our podcast. Okay, great. So we have the cover image back that we set in the Castos dashboard, the name of the podcast, myself as the host, and the little brief description here. Last thing we want to set is how often we're planning on publishing new episodes. This is not set in stone, but let's just say weekly for now. We can save this information, and now we'll click Publish, and our podcast is live. And Apple makes it kind of difficult. They hide this little link down here. If you copy this, this is the link to your podcast in Apple Podcasts, and this is the place where people can subscribe to your show to get every episode as soon as you publish it. We'll go back to our Castos dashboard now, close this out, and down here in the manual distribution, we'll just click on Settings for Apple Podcasts because our show is live there now, and we'll paste that URL that we got from Apple in here, and we'll click Save. Great. Now that we've refreshed this page, we see that Spotify is active and our show is live here. Amazon Music is also active. Amazon makes it a little more difficult. You have to go find your podcast link there. And once you do, you're able to come back here and enter that in the settings area so that your podcast website and the Castos player automatically link to your podcast on all of these directories, right? It makes it super easy for folks on your website or seeing the player to just click a button, open up the podcast app of their choice, and subscribe to your podcast so they get every episode automatically. And that's really just how podcast distribution works, right? The concept of the RSS feed is so magic because you can publish once in your Castos dashboard and it automatically goes out everywhere automatically magic every time you publish, right? You publish once and it goes everywhere that your audience is already listening. You just repeat the same process for Google Podcast, Stitcher, Pocket Cast, and all the popular podcast directories. We have a fantastic blog post. If you just search for podcast directories, Castos has a great blog post of 28 places that you want to have your show live. This is just an example of how to do this. And in that blog post, we have really detailed instructions on how to submit your podcast everywhere that you should so that you can maximize the discoverability and audience building for your podcast. I hope that's helpful and insightful on just how podcast distribution works in general. Any questions, just let us know.